how do we see it in current places, such as hip hop? How are young people using spoken word? How is it a reflection of the oral tradition, whereas African people that come from the diaspora that were captured and brought here and enslaved really come out of this kind of oral tradition? And when we think of pastors, when we think of even pimps and players and all of those iconoclastic images, they are embodying this notion of language, and so it's a spoken kind of tradition. So we'll just go through a few succession of questions that are tailored to each individual, and then we'll open it up from you all, and we hope to have a little robust discussion. We'll only go for about maybe 50 minutes because we're wanting to stay on time. So whatever the time is, I will make sure that we end at the appropriate time, and we can continue this conversation anytime you see me or anytime you see these people that are here. So I'll allow each person to introduce him or herself, and then we'll move forward. I don't like introductions, so I'll just say my name is Andre, Professor Andre DeMos, and we just keep it at that, and we'll just go here.
How y'all doing? My name is Alfonso Washington. I'm a sophomore here at Albany State University, originally from Indianapolis, Indiana, in a middle grade education major.
I'm Dr. Ivan Page from the Department of Social Work here at Albany State. I am Professor Ray Proctor. I am a professor of speech and theater in the Fine Arts Department. My PhD is in Shakespeare Studies.
I'm Pat Bonner, and I work in the English, Modern Languages, and Mass Communications Department. This is my first year here at Albany State.
I'm Kiera Lawrence. I'm a sophomore here at Albany State University. I'm a mass comm major and originally from Charlotte, North Carolina.
Good. So let's just open up with a general question. The ideal of for each of you, what is your involvement or what is your experience with poetry of any kind, whether it be spoken word, lyric poetry, or just poetry in general? We'll start with Dr. Bonner and work our way around.
I've taught African American poetry for many years, and I teach it with a passion. So my first goal is always to get students to develop a passion for poetry. When we read the older poets, like maybe a Francis Watkins Harper or George Moses Horton, a lot of times we don't feel what they felt or we can't really connect with the experience. So one of the things I try to do is make my class relevant to students. In high school, you're taught about Longfellow, Emerson, Thoreau, but you're not taught about Francis Watkins Harper, George Moses Horton, Fenton Johnson. And as an African American, you learn in the public school system everything about everybody else and very little about yourself. So to be whole and to do more than imitate what you see on TV or what you see in magazines, you have to have a knowledge of your literature. And we have other panelists, but in the teaching of poetry, my number one connection is to history and culture. We also talk about the lives of these courageous poets. And the final thing is craft. We study the craft of poetry so that when we move beyond African American poetry, we'll be able to look at poetry in any tradition and talk about the techniques used to put it together.
So in 1990 through 1993, I'm going to back up a little bit before that. I was raised in Newark, New Jersey. Poetry was not the top of the list for anything that we did in Newark, New Jersey. Ultimately, I left Newark and I ended up in the middle of St. Louis, Missouri at Webster University. And I was an English major. You can't get out of Webster University in St. Louis, Missouri as an English major without taking modern English poetry, major British writers. Part of major British writers was this poetry section. And I would read all of these poems about a leaf or a tree or a sun coming through. I didn't know what these poems were about and didn't care. I was like, this doesn't mean anything to me. And then I came across, someone introduced me, actually a Ghanaian poet, introduced me to Paul Laurence Dunbar's The Party. And I went, these are my people. I know this. I know the rhythms. I laughed. I recognized people. And all of a sudden, poetry meant something to me. All of a sudden, poetry, I was like, I understood the rhythms, I understood the sounds, and I could hear the voices. And I went, this makes sense to me. And finally, when I understood how poetry made sense to me emotively, I was then able to go back to my other classes and go, oh, I see what you're doing. I understand the tricks that you're playing. You're talking about the sublime. You're talking about the ethereal. Well, my experience with the sublime and the ethereal is different because I come from a different culture of traditions. My mother, my grandmother, my great grandmother would sit around and they would use language and they would make nonverbal communications, sometimes guttural communications. What we did with language is so vastly different. But it's not something like English poetry is not something that is beyond us. It's not at all beyond us. But I had to understand personally why it mattered, why it was important. Sometimes grappling with the sublime is what we're doing. We just have a different, we collectively have a different culture and history with how that's done.
Not too far from Newark, New Jersey, was Trenton, New Jersey, where I grew up.
Check that out.
So inner city life, it was rough, it was hard. Coming from a male perspective, you always had to be on your P's and Q's, watch your back. Poetry, from a young age, allowed me to be in touch with my inner self that I could not express outwardly in the streets because, you had to be kind of tough. I grew up around a male kind of dominated environment where you didn't cry. You didn't express when things hurt or you had problems. So I used poetry as a way of expressing things that was inside of me, things that I wanted to get out. And so I kind of continued all that, even though I've kind of went into other areas of social work. I always looked at poetry as a way of talking about social experiences, what's going on in our lives and the things that we feel. So I beg to differ in terms of trying to that outward extended self. But the internal thing in poetry allows you to dig real deep in your soul and say things in a way that people don't really understand. They have to say, what is they saying by I know the blues and the blues know me? Are they talking about they like blues music or they have some blues inside of them that they're talking about? So it allows you to talk about those things without folks really knowing what you're saying. It's not like a self-reflective paper that we do in social work. You can kind of hide little things in poetry, but you can get those things out that you really need to get out. So it's been rewarding for me to allow me to be in touch with myself, and it has helped me be a better father because I'm in touch with my feelings. I'm also have two daughters, so it allows me to understand their needs and their concerns better. And I do that through a lot of poetry, and it kind of sensitized me, in other words.
Well, for my personal connection, it was all about the transitional period that I was going through by the time when I was 12 years old and I was moving to Georgia, and it was an identity struggle, trying to find who I was, and also trying to get away from the path that I was going down, because I was kind of getting involved with people who weren't very influential in a good way. So I used poetry to get away from that and, really speak my mind and talk about the people that I was learning about through my parents and in my classes and different things like that. So really, my connection to poetry comes back to who I come from with my parents and my grandparents and those black militant people that are in my family and becoming that through poetry.
My connection started off with my grandmother, who is now a retired English teacher. Basically, when I wanted to go to the store in North Carolina, I had to write a poem about going to the store. If I wanted to go play basketball for some reason, she made me write a poem about playing basketball. And at first, I saw no point in it at all until I grew up and got older. And, I realized that I had I usually don't express how I feel out loud, so I needed another outlet besides drawing or dancing. And poetry was my outlet, and that still is my outlet. And I just utilize that today to express how I feel. Like you said right here, it's an expression. You can hide what you're saying, basically, but you're still expressing it through poetry. It's not as direct as just speaking. So that's my personal connection.
May I add a word?
Go ahead.
While you're in college, you have an opportunity to study the tradition of African American poetry. And poetry is really a reflection or a mirror of reality. And if you can learn about the Black experience through studying poetry, you can actually hear voices from the past. So, again, one way that you honor those who have gone before you and sacrificed is and left a written story or poem for you is by studying them and knowing about them, because if you don't know about the African American poetry and the tradition, who will? Who will care? So it is a part of your growth academically, but it is also a way of connecting to the past and drawing strength from the past.
Good, thank you. Now, for me, I was not going to include myself, but for me, I think poetry has always been something that I've done in one form or another. And one of the ways that most of us that have any Judeo-Christian experience have experienced poetry would be Easter, right? Is that we give them these little poems or these little sayings. And sometimes it may be Jesus wept, but it's our first time really to go up and hold the mic, right? And we have everyone's attention. And for me, I wrote poetry at a very, very young age. And by the time I went to college, I became a spoken word artist. And one of the reasons that I stopped doing it, though, was my concern with the commerciality of it. And so when we go back to someone like Gil Scott Heron that's saying the revolution must be televised, what I'm wanting to segue into now, I know Mr. Washington is really into spoken word heavily because he's constantly saying, Professor Andre, I want you to watch this particular person, sending me this particular person. I wanted to look at it from a young person's perspective and look at two particular areas. I wanted to ask, how has the commerciality of spoken word damaged or enhanced the integrity of poetry in general? And I'm also wanting us to consider, how have artists like Wale and a few others been able to transition themselves from being rap artists to also this ideal of spoken word artists? How do you see those two working together, sir?
Well, I definitely don't think that it has damaged the art of poetry. I think it's promoting it in a very good way because it's letting young people get involved, and to where it's playing a part where it's bringing young people together with old people, because old people, they have the art of loving poetry and everything like that. So I think the really good thing about it is that it's letting our young people get involved and wanting to be a part of the movement, making their voice be heard, talk about poetry, get involved with poetry, write their own poems. And then it's the whole thing with hip hop, because hip hop is so big now, and you have those people like Common and Wale who aren't just rap artists, but their lyrics are really telling a story. And that's the main thing about poetry. It's all about telling a story. And you can kind of you can find those artists who are differentiating themselves between other people in the hip hop generation, in the hip hop world. So no, I don't think it has damaged poetry at all. I really think it's really helping the movement.
Good, good. I like your answer there. That one thing, that caveat, right? Is you use the adjective there, young and old. We could just say younger and older, right?
Yeah, yeah, not old.
Ancient there. Good. I want to turn to Dr. Proctor here. And this is coming out of conjunction of when we look at something like Wolf's rewriting of Zordner Hurston Tales and Spunk, right, in this linguistic conversation that you and I have. So I want to ask, what are some of the linguistic patterns and practices and trends you see in African American performances that have continually been used from the Harlem Renaissance to now? What are some of those practices that particularly you find to be attractive that we still see in modern performances today?
Um, we don't have. So the thing that keeps occurring to me over and over and over is mastery. Being a master of a language. We are the owners. We have taken this skill and we will take it and recreate the rules. Not because we can't meet your rules. So without becoming all about history, we are a group of people that was brought here from another country and forced to learn a new language and given new words for gods and all kinds of things. And as a group of people that transitioned from being owned property legally to people attaining the right of personhood, if you will. One of the rights of, or one of the ways we establish personhood is via language. We have looked at the culture by which we were enslaved and says, we are not less than you. We are masters of your own language. language. We can do things with your language that you've never imagined. We did it with jazz, we did it with sculpture, we do it with poetry. We do it with plays all the time. So in the 1920s, 1930s, you have Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote who wrote a novel, writing short stories, novelist, playwright. She wrote something called A Story in Harlem Slang. The Harlem Renaissance was a time of rebirth. It was beauty. It was looking at old rules for language and writing and everything, taking them, owning them, mastering them, and saying, you've never thought about doing this with language. You've never, your brains are so, and it was quite literally a black and white thing. It was black culture looking at white culture going, you have this language, but you've never used it to do all of the things that it's capable of doing. Zora Neale Hurston was doing things with language that broke the rules of the dominant culture, broke the rules of what a woman was supposed to be able to do, what a black woman should never have been able to do, and a black woman from rural southern Florida. She stepped out and she said, I own this language, and you will follow me. She said it to black men, black women, black culture, and white culture. And she was subsequently her voice was diminished for about 30, 40 years. But so what she does with language is about mastering, showing mastery of rules, and then going beyond, and then literally breaking the box apart. This follows in a much broader tradition. The Europeans call it the avant-garde, and they were taking strange and wonderful baby steps with what language could do. We learned a language, mastered it, and it flourished in ways that resonate still in hip hop. They resonate in the way we write plays. Straight from Zora Neale Hurston, we have the Funny House of a Negro by Adrienne Kennedy, in which she did things with structure and language. It was mastering the form from the dominant culture. We have to look at the way we use the English language. Some people in this room may or may not have heard the phrase, "Well, you talk white." That is such a horrible thing to say. We have mastered the English language that we were forced to learn, and we can go beyond that. We can go beyond those rules, and what we do, the beauty we create with language, is how what Zora Neale Hurston was doing, how that survives. And what happens in spoken word poetry, I don't see it as something different. There's a conversation that happens between music and playwriting, performance of word. The performance of word is a conversation that's happening in poetry, in music, and on stage. So we have to look at the forms that we have mastered and how we are creating and utilizing language to establish our own identity, to resist being bowled over by waves of "you're not good enough."
Good, good. Thank you, sir. Let's transition, Dr. Bonner, and get go in a different vein for a second, because we're going to run out of time, and I really want to give the audience something, but I'm gonna come back to you. I want to turn attention here just for a little bit. Lawrence, Miss Lawrence, I know that you write. So the question I have for you is that when you write poetry, do you think of an audience in mind, or do you just simply write from where you're coming from? And then do you think of the ideal of it being a performed piece, or do you think of it as just poetry and then you find ways to perform it later?
It's actually both at times. It could be times where I just sit down and I just find myself writing my emotions down on paper. I have no idea in that period of time what the purpose is or anything. I'm just writing out my emotions, and that turns into a poem. And I'm not sure if I want to perform it or not, but there are other times where I actually sit down and I say, okay, I want to perform something. I want it to be on this topic, and I reflect my poem off of the topic that I choose, and then I perform it.
Good.
So it's not necessarily one or the other. It's actually both depending on how I'm feeling in that point in time.
Good, and I like that idea that it doesn't have to be dichotomous and this kind of meshing. It just kind of go with the flow, and that's what poetry is about. I'm gonna come back to you, Dr. Bonner, in a second, but Dr. Page, I want to ask you, when we start to think about dealing with people that have had traumatic experiences and dealing with trying to explain things in a classroom context, or even when you as a social worker is trying to help someone, is poetry an option for you, or is music or one of the arts an option? And how do you utilize that ideal of a spoken one speaking his or her own experience to get over it or to find his or her way through it.
As a trained social worker, I do have concerns because we're so caught up in a box where you have people need help, you help them through this particular agency or a program. And I think that I would challenge my colleagues in the field of social work to get out of that vein, that there's so many different ways that we could tell a story. And spoken words or poetry is one way that we could tell a story of what people are going through. Last year I wrote a poem called In Retrospect. I told a story about a single mother who had put so much time into her son and neglected her own personal life. Her son ended up in jail doing 25 years. And when he was being taken away, she looked around and she had nothing left. She didn't even know who she was. She had put so much time in that. And that was a true situation that happened that I had to work with the young lady through that. And so I think that if we begin to tell our stories through spoken word, through poems, it can open up so many different avenues about the issues that people are going through. And we as social workers, I think we get caught up in the box, and I'm really concerned. And I do challenge my colleagues in that area to look beyond that. And I always try to believe that a poem or poetry has a central message. So the goal is to understand that central message and how we can move forward. So that's how I like to see more of this. That's why I'm really pleased to be a part of this panel, to not only highlight social work and the need of social work to be involved in the spoken word, but how we can advance the story, the problems of people that we help in the field.
Good, good. Dr. Bonner, chime back in. I don't mean
Just about from an older person's point of view about spoken word. I love it. I enjoy it. I get nourishment from it. But the truth is, there are only 3 HBCUs in the country with the creative writing program. So all of the performance and the things we're doing, uh, they're not really leading to the study of the art of poetry, the artistry and mastery. And I'd like to announce that we will be getting a creative writing program here at Albany State with a course in Black spoken word. So I'm enjoying everything, but I want students to be undergirded with the study of the tradition and history of poetry too. That's it.
good, good, good. I'll ask maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll see if there are any questions from the audience, and we'll try to round things out. But one of the things I'm wanting us to consider, and building back on what Dr. Bonner is talking about here, is that one way we're wanting to, if we remember what many of the poets that we've seen this particular for this particular session and this particular year have talked about consistently is reading and writing, right? Is that to be a poet is to actually read poets. To be a musician is to know musicians. I mean, particularly when we talk about a genre like hip hop, is that it's built off of this ideal of taking the previous generation's music and doing something with it. And I think one of the things now is that spoken word performance and spoken word is just that. It's an opportunity. Whereas we saw earlier this morning from early college, a few of the young people that actually did their poetry, one of the young ladies was very emotional. She was telling her story. And so, in that kind of way, now what if we begin to engage and read poetry and teach it in a way, we begin to see that these stories are the stories of our people. These stories are the stories of humanity. So the larger question here is, how can each of us, as we leave this particular session and we leave here, how can we think of poetry in a way that we encourage people not only to write, but to read, right? And to read and write and reproduce. So how can each of us in our own different ways, right? And as far as even in performance, how can we ask a student to re-envision this work, look at it, look at the context of it, right? And for you, how can you encourage yours? Well, okay, I saw this, Professor Andre, but can you tell me a piece of work that it reminds me of? And what we do when we do this, we connect larger bodies of people and larger bodies of work together. And this is how we become scholars. This is how we become the poets. Because Emir Baraka didn't become a poet overnight, right? As Pericles didn't become a poet and a dramatist overnight. It takes time to work on the craft. And the only way we get through it is to read, write, test, read, and write. So let's just do this. Let's just see, are there any questions? Because we're close to, we got about 18 minutes, but I really want to stop in enough time so they can start for the next session. Are there any questions from anybody out in the audience? Because we do have a nice panel here. I mean, They're all experts in their own right. Any questions or concerns that you have, or any comments? Yes, sir, Dr. Johnson.
Well, hello, everyone. There's something that I'm very interested in hearing from a younger generation here in Congress. I'm a parent of a teenager, and there's a general thing that keeps coming up that as a parent I am teaching and guiding through this, which is the issue of having talent and ability is not the same as doing the work. And what I have noticed quite often as an instructor and as a parent, that a lot of times the two get confused. I have the ability to sing or dance or write or draw, but me sitting down and actually working out the skill becomes a different issue. And like I said, it's something that I constantly struggle with professionally and personally in my own household. But I would like to hear how younger folks connect the two. Your God-given natural ability versus your interest in putting forth the work to develop a skill set. Yes.
Well, I know for myself, like,
Please speak a little louder, sir.
well, I know for myself, like, if I was trying to work with something, I used to have like a more of a like photographic memory. I could just look through something and not have to work that hard to be done with it and take the test, get a 98 on it. And so I can understand that, but at the same time, it's that procrastination slash, I don't know, but you know, that procrastination and lack of being able to have that structure so as to continuously do something so that you can be successful. Like if you're going to master anything in the world, it's repetition, repetition. You got to actually get up and do the work and all that stuff. So I understand the frustration of that, but I guess it's because we rely on that without having our skill so much. Like me, that looking at because I can just look at something like that, I don't really need to too much worry about studying for the same test if I can just re-look at the book and skim through, sift through it and then find the right thing. You know, that's probably one of the reasons why. But in time, those things will go away. So what you will have left is your routine, and routine that's what needs to be developed so as to get it right, and that's how you get successful in anything on planet Earth. So.
Yeah, the young lady. You don't want it anymore? Can you change your mind? Don't be afraid. The young man here and then here.
I was just gonna say the same thing he did. Like me, I'm naturally pretty good at mathematics, but I struggle with procrastination myself. I still struggle with it to this day. But it's all about you once again practicing your talent, like enhance, because you could be naturally good at something. Like for example, Michael Jordan wasn't. He had talent for basketball, but he wasn't Michael Jordan until he actually practiced every day shooting the basketball and all that. He already knew he had the talent, but he became the greatest because he, added to it by practicing. So that's what we all really struggle with to be perfect. So,
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I want to second that. That is the model of the athlete or the musician. That is rehearsing 6-7 hours a day, practicing a long period of time. So I think that model is one that we have to use a lot more. The difference between a gift, as you say, or a talent, and cultivating that talent through education and study. And I wanted to applaud the fact that you may be developing a creative writing program here, because that is now the rage across the country, as you know. I teach in a department from which 3 of the people who have been here graduated, Denise Bond, Jeffrey Mack, and of course Damaris Hill, who was on Vimeo. The creative writing program has outstripped everything else we do in that department. I am one of its biggest critics, primarily because it is not teaching people who want to read. It is not, it is a commercialization of the program itself and the artist who wants to be a published poet, but not necessarily to read. That may be okay for some people, but in my position, in my commitment is when students of color come into that program, they cannot afford to follow that path. I can't take on the whole world, but I can take on that part of the world that I know best, that is my world. And that is, you do have to read, you do have to cultivate your talent. And so I think what you have an opportunity to do in the program here is to tell everybody else how to really do a creative writing program.
It will have academic rigor.
That is not just to see it as the talent will be developed and you'll get your Nobel Prize winning book, 2 years after you graduate with a book contract. But by not reading very much. So I think the model of the athlete, the model of the musician, we have to adopt those models of training and studying. We did see Baraka read and write music criticism. He understands, he includes music in his performance. He understands music intuitively. He's studied this stuff before. He's written about bebop. He's written about jazz. That doesn't come by somehow just having a gift. That comes through rigorous, as you say, training. So I think you might be teaching the rest of the world. In other words, HBCUs can go leap years ahead, I think, in doing what you just described, mastering something and then showing the possibilities for doing it in a new way. When you thought we were behind the ball, we can actually get in front of the ball and roll it up the hill without it falling back down, because we've had to struggle so much, we know how to do that really well.
Let's hear from two students and then I'll come.
Sir, we'll try to tie things together. Yes, sir, Mr. Freeman, and then here, Ms. Lawrence.
To go back to the original question, a man of their plate, dealing with hard work and talent, I feel personally that the art of hard work has really been lost in our generation due to the fact of everything becoming so easy and accessible to us. Just like with everybody got a phone where if you want to know something, you can Google it. We got cars, we can just drive where we gotta go. We don't have to walk or get on a bike. And that naturally goes into our person, whereas if we have natural talent or something comes to you, we don't want to put additional work into it to master it, as you can say. So it's also a cultural thing as far as how far we have advanced actually hinders us a little bit. We have to fight past how easy things can be and make them challenging for yourself so that you work hard to try to become them.
Good. One of the things that I think is for me is that oftentimes
I do have a lot of students in my office, and Ms. Luster and Dr. Bonner can attest to that, but sometimes the students are there talking, and they're just hanging out. And one student was there in particular, and she was trying to talk to me, and I was talking to her, but I was working at the same time. And I produced this document that was about 4 pages, and she was like, "You just did that?" I was like, "I just did this right now." So a lot of times in our world, as professors and instructors, we have to be the model here. Is that if we show the hard work, it's cool and everything. People think, talking about hip hop or talking about poetry, but on the other side, I read. I read quite often. I write quite often. So there's a practice there that we have to emulate one for the other. And if students are able to see us do it, it makes it a whole lot better, because oftentimes we require these long papers from them and they never see us doing any work. And then truth of the matter is we have 4 or 5 classes, we're delayed in getting it back, so then they question our work ethic there. So there is this kind of thing that we're wanting to kind of reinforce in a way. We'll hear from you and then we'll come to one more and then we'll try tie things together. Sure.
Back to the original question when it came to both talent versus hard work. When I was in high school, I used to play basketball, and basically I was talented, but I would slack off. And what my coach would tell me was that hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. So basically, in order for you to get your talent out there, you have to work hard. If I'm writing poetry, I have to broaden my vocabulary. I have to write and rewrite poetry over and over again in order to get my talent out there. My work ethic will support my talent, basically.
Good. Good. Yes, sir.
So, some very quick things. Curious. I need what I as an instructor need is you all have to be interested in hearing the world. You have to listen. Everyone says, work hard, hard work, but specifically what we mean is you have to read. You have to be intellectually curious about other people who have said stuff. The misconception I think that a lot of people have is that spoken word is just one person going out and spitting rhymes, but they're actually listening. Some of the best poets are actually responding to what they are hearing in the world. So there is a dialogue that's happening between that poet and something they're hearing in the world. And I think one of the things that I'm searching for as a professor is how do I instill an intellectual curiosity in my students? How do I inspire you all to to read and read voraciously so that your vocabularies increase, so that your writing skills increase? So that's one of my goals.
Yes, ma'am.
It's really this basic and honest for me. Slaves risked their lives to learn how to read and write. They got their fingers cut off, they got their eyes plucked out just to be able to read and write. That's a legacy that was given to me. And how dare I turn my back on the courageous slaves who found their voice, found a way to read and learn. And then today we have all of these freedoms and we walk away from it.
And yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Just a comment, because the way it seems is like students are taking advantage of their opportunities, but I feel like just like a typical professors coming from an English major, a good thing to do is like you don't have freedom when it comes to literature and reading because each professor has their own experiences and they want us to experience that with them, so they have their own projected ideals of what you should feel about this, and you need to feel this way about this, and you got to get this out of this, and we don't have the opportunity to feel it for ourselves, so it's kind of like, well, this is work, I don't want to do it, instead of them saying, okay, you take this, read it, tell me what you get from it, and let's talk about it. They're just like, I'm a professor, I have a doctorate, and this is what it is.
Because one of the things here, the problematics will be is that when we matriculate through high school, I mean, in truth, one of the things that are not, there are several things that are not talked about consistently. Race would be one of those things, gender would be one of those things, and sexual orientation would be the other. So now it's not going to act like it's going to happen miraculously overnight that we're going to come into this resolution, because now if I ask the general pool of people, young people in the room, how long ago slavery existed and how long ago was it before slavery was abolished? How long did slavery last? And how far removed are we from slavery? The typical answer, right? And I don't think that this is your problem. I do think it is a part of a generational problem and not the passing of the baton. So the simple fact of the matter is we have much work to do here. One of the ways to begin to broach this kind of conversation is through spoken word. And in that way, we can talk about oral tradition. We can talk about Frederick Douglass. We can talk about Harriet Jacobs. We can talk about Wale. We can talk about the modernity of things. And this is why we are proposing to do such. Now, I want to thank you for this session. I would like to bring to your attention that in 2014 of April, we will have a hip-hop conference here on campus. We will have Ed Lover from Yo MTV Raps will be here. Dr. Elaine Richardson from The Ohio State University will be here. Play of Kid and Play will be here. We will have hip-hop fashion show. We will have other things going on as well. And we'll continue this type of conversation. Again, thank you for coming out and enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to the last session. Thank you.